I said, the only thing I think after being exposed to everything I don't really want to do is clandestine labs
Why?
because the dangers associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
This was in the early days when people were really learning about protective measures and things of that nature. And as we went through our basic training at DEA, it was like, well, everything you go in a lab is going to kill you. The gases are going to kill you. The acids are going to eat you up. This is going to happen. So I got reassigned to San Diego to the clandestine lab group. And to top it off, at that time, San Diego was the epicenter of the production of methamphetamine in the entire country.
Yeah.
My first year we were there, the Clan Lab group and the task force combined, there was over 180 labs seized at that time. The Clan Lab groups were more long-term investigative ones, where the task force were a lot of responses. But on one hand, it was the epicenter. This is where the labs were, and these were not mom and pop labs. These were big cookers. The smallest lab you ever found was cooking 20 pounds of meth at a time.
Yeah.
I mean, and you have many, many biggers. One of the first labs I ever went into had 750-liter flasks going at once. And that's a super lab. You only see those things in Mexico now.
What was the typical method that you were seeing back then?
It was the ephedrine reduction method.
Okay.
The P2P method was kind of a Northern California thing, but at that time the chemicals were not so regulated. So you could actually purchase everything you needed by going to a couple chemical shops. And in fact, that's how we made a lot of cases. And you could put together a lab setup really easy with a fairly easy recipe. And one of the standard methods we would use when we didn't have something pending was we would sit on these chemical distributor shops and we would watch people go in. Normally these places, particularly, they were kind of they were rogue merchants.
Yeah.
They didn't have a lot of business, but then you would see somebody come in, you run the plates on the car, you find out, well, the guy's been arrested 3 times for narcotics. You see him come out with a 22-liter flask and a heating mantle. You're like, okay, he's going to be cooking meth soon. So you would normally conduct a surveillance on them, follow them to where they went. And back then, these crooks weren't so sophisticated. They would normally go to where they would probably manufacture. You would do your run-ups on the house, get all the background information, do subpoenas on the various chemical stores to find out what these guys may have purchased, because some of this still had to be logged. And eventually you would write a search warrant. And probably 75% of that time you get a cooking lab, or the other times you get a boxed lab. And it was a very unique time. And we did a lot of very simple things. We ran power usages on the house, because if you had a lab running, you were eating up your electrical bill.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a telltale sign also.
What safety-wise for you guys, how was it? I know when I was on the Clan Lab group shortly after, but a couple of years after you had already started, did you guys have SCBAs? How were you treating those?
We did, and
Okay.
I was very fortunate. So I got out of the academy in May, and DEA really formalized their clandestine laboratory training at that time. They had a clandestine lab, what they called safety school, and an investigative school. They were 2 separate 1-week schools. So as California was the epicenter, there was a lot of coordination with the State Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement. So I think it was June of that year, I went to a Clan Lab Safety School up in Sacramento, California. And there we learned how to wear SCBAs and our respirators, how to properly don and doff your equipment, wear your safety equipment. But no one had this equipment. We were all buying it. It wasn't centric to DEA. The divisions were buying it on their own.
Oh, okay.
And then a month later, I went to San Francisco to go to Clan Lab Investigation School because it's very specialized. And so the same thing, but it was a growing process. And I was in the clandestine laboratory team, which subsequently became known as CLET teams, clandestine laboratory enforcement teams. And the program became more and more formalized over the years. So I was in on the early years of the formalization. Guys were working Clan Labs long before that.
Yeah.
I mean, back to the 70s. But this is when it started to get formalized. So I was fortunate, but a funny story aside to that. So that summer, I made my first criminal case. It was Clan Lab investigation. We wrote a search warrant, all night, all day surveillance on a rural location. The guy we were looking at, I still remember his name, it was Doug Fisher. He had a violent background. So it was determined by the senior agents and management in the group, we should use the sheriff's SWAT team to hit this place. It's rural, guy could be violent. So I'm all excited for my first case, getting this search warrant, and don't even get to do the raid. But so we do the raid, and we don't have a cooking lab at the time, but he's got lab equipment everywhere, contaminated stuff everywhere, and so I'm like, okay, Clan Lab, we got to put on the safety equipment and everything. And with the old time chemist, one of the best chemists ever, Harry Skinner from San Diego, from the Southwest Lab, and so I'm like, okay, we got to go into like, it wasn't a Connex box, but some sort of storage shed. And it's just fumes are everywhere. And I'm like, all right, Harry, we got to put this gear on. He's like, nah, he puts on an army fatigue coat and his gloves and goes in. I'm like, well, I'm wearing a face. I just went to this training. I need to do this.
Yeah.
And it was a growing time, because at the same time at the San Diego division out back, we had a Connex box. And we had an old agent in our group. He was in his 50s at that time. He had come on in the 50s as an IRS agent, Marv Middleman. And the guy was a genius, great investigator. And he's like, hey, we got to take care of this stuff that's out here in this Connex box. There was no set process on how to dispose of stuff back in the. So we go in there, and it's got everything from my hazardous lab school said, don't go near this stuff sitting in this box. Contaminated glassware, chemicals, everything. And we had to figure out how to get rid of this. That's a long story in and of itself, but it was like, I think I had too much knowledge at that time. Like, we should not be in here right now. So
back in the day when you were doing that, did they start from the very beginning with you in terms of every year you got a physical?
yes,
Okay.
when we started that program, we did. It was every year you got a physical, so they established baselines to see if you had any health issues. And a big part of that physical, I mean, until when I retired, we were still doing the same thing.
Yeah.
They wanted to make sure that you could wear the proper protective breathing apparatus, that your lung capacity was good and you were in good enough shape.
Yeah.
Because there's a level, I guess, you can hurt yourself if your lung capacity is not that good.
Can you talk about that triple neck scientific case?
Sure. Our group, and we won the administrator's award for this. I was not the case agent on the case, but I was a member of the team that participated. We ran a storefront operation in San Diego. There was a chemical store called Triple Neck Scientific. Well, the owner was an informant of ours. Rules were pretty loose in those days because the chemicals were all legal that people could buy, but he was cooperating with us, and we actually installed a California Bureau of Narcotics Enforcement agent in as an undercover, also working there. His name's Chuck. Great guy, older guy. He was pushing 60 probably at the time, but he looked like a biker. And we had the store wired for sound, wired for film. They could properly or legally sell the chemicals in the glassware for clandestine labs at the time. And so people would come in. We know what they're shopping for. We'd identify these people, gather the intelligence on them. They'd buy the stuff, and subsequently we would be raiding them and getting their labs. And we built up great cases. I don't the exact number. I think in that case, over the couple of years we ran it, we seized 25 or 30 meth labs, arrested over 130 people in that investigation, and I don't know how many hundreds of firearms we seized in that case.
Wow.
Because with the meth cookers, the meth users, firearms with their paranoia was a very common occurrence.
Yeah. So were they pretty violent back in the day?
They were.
Okay.
They were. We had several shootings in the group, and the office had, another group had several shootings, normally revolving around methamphetamine. But I grew to like being in the Clan Lab group, and it was exciting times for a young guy.